Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writing for Roleplay, a tabletop RPG podcast. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Kayla.
And today we will be talking about a very important topic, especially for GMs, and that is crafting your NPCs. Now, last episode was talking about creating your characters from a player perspective. And an episode we'll do in the future is talking about creating your villains, your big bads, the ones who drive the plot by being so gosh darn evil and or misunderstood. But this episode specifically will be focusing on creating everyone else. All the people that are in the background who represent the factions or members of a village or the people who are standing in your way. All of the other people that fill out the world that your players just go around and mess things up in.
The background actors, the guest stars, the co-stars, etc.
Gotta get those extras, folks.
No, they're background actors.
Background actors, there we go. And as long as they don't say anything, we don't have to pay them as much.
Yep. That's very true.
So this is going to be a common trend in this podcast, but I think a lot about crafting narratives in tabletop RPGs from a utility perspective. I will start out from a point of what do I need, and then craft from there. There are some people, as we mentioned in the world building episode, who like to just plan out the whole world, and when they create a town, they immediately come up with like 25 different NPCs that are all around the different places, and the players probably won't even interact with like 60% of them. Some people are like that. That's fine. I start with what I need and then go from there. But I have found that in creating so many different NPCs and having to create them on the fly based off, what players find interesting in a given moment, what corners that they go into that I may not have necessarily prepared for, I've noticed that there are long trends of the kinds of NPCs that you create. And once again, this is coming from a utility angle. Like, I'm not thinking in terms of like, oh, this would be a really interesting like character with a cool backstory. I'm thinking of them in terms of how do they interact with the players and what role do they serve in the adventure that I'm creating or in the world that I'm trying to make feel real. So, Kayla, any thoughts before I kind of get into a list of NPCs that I usually think about while crafting these?
Yeah. You can have whole games, technically, where NPCs don't really come up, aside from, like, a villain. Generally, in, like, one-shots, I think you could probably get away with there not really being actual NPCs that you interact with. It's just kind of, there's people in the background because it would be weird to be in this crowded city without people being around you. But the players never really interact with any NPCs that aren't like the villain. But I think NPCs are some of the most, for the characters, I love meeting new NPCs because it's always like, ooh, who is this person? It's fun to meet new people. Like, who's this person going to be? Are they friendly? Are they not? Am I going to kill them eventually? Am I going to want to kill them? Is my player going to get overly attached to them for some reason? It's a realm of possibilities with the NPCs. It is interesting. It makes a lot of sense to me that you start from a completely utilitarian point of view on these NPCs and that they sort of start as, for lack of better term, plot devices. And it'll be interesting, I guess, sort of to explore these different styles of NPCs and then to talk about DM PCs and the PCs that sort of take on a little bit of a life of their own. I wonder, get in the comments, do NPCs become incredibly vital to your games? Because I do kind of wonder if this perception of like favorite NPCs or NPCs that are really important, if that's something that kind of comes out of actual plays a little bit, with actual plays having a small handful of like really important recurring NPCs, or if that's just kind of a feature of the game. Because we've had NPCs that are pretty important to our party, and part of that has been having a slightly smaller party in a couple of our games, and then part of that was like something that was with Out of the Abyss, it was something that was built into the module. With Curse of Strahd, it's built into the module with there being, depending on the plotline path that you take, there's kind of at least one very important NPC to the party, if not two or three. And with Descent into Avernus, I don't think we had one important NPC really that comes to mind, and that was the boyfriend character. And that was something, correct me if I'm wrong, but that entirely came out of that character's backstory of like they have this boyfriend they're looking for, and it just sort of provided a little bit of a plot hook to get us to the city. Was that she was looking for her boyfriend, and then her boyfriend disappeared, and that was just a part of, like, you know, we talked about character creation and backstory and motivation. That was just something that happened out of that. It wasn't something that was built into the module, so there wasn't any like party NPCs kind of aside from him, I think.
And I think that's also something that can be a bit specific to our group, because from what I've seen from you guys as players, you're much more willing to acknowledge an NPC as like a member of the group and as a character that you guys want to hang out with and interact with and bring them on all your adventures. But I have also GM'd for groups who treat NPCs like hirelings. Like, this is someone who is following us to carry our stuff, and we're not really interested in interacting with this NPC as much as we are interested in interacting with each other, the real players.
Yeah, for sure. We do get it's become a joke that we have to have at least one NPC in the party. It's like our emotional support NPC. And so that is why, and again, you see that in actual plays, and we've seen that in our personal games. But yeah, that's why I'm curious. I'm like, I don't know how common it is. So
I will say this, that as a GM, you never know what NPCs your party is going to fixate on. And I mean that in both a positive and negative way. There will be NPCs who you'll have players be like, oh, they're my new best friend. And you'll have NPCs who players are like, I hate this person now, and I'm going to dedicate my life to destroying them. And it's like, what do you do?
And sometimes it's going to be the same character getting both of those reactions out of different members of the party. There is absolutely, in our current game, a character in Curse of Strahd who one of our party members absolutely hates his guts, and another party member is like, I don't know, he's kind of my little guy. He's my little buddy, my little pal. Let's keep him around. Let's see what happens. And that's a way to get interesting sort of dynamics going. And so tell me about NPCs, Kevin. How do you...
So usually when I'm thinking about
NPCs... Tell me about your little guys.
Yeah, I'll tell you about my little guys. Usually when I'm thinking about NPCs, I'm thinking of them in terms of like, what is their purpose in this adventure? And a lot of times it comes down to these like specific roles. First, you have like your quest givers or your quest objects, where they are incredibly important to the narrative of the adventure or quest or heist or whatever you're doing. They are essentially a living MacGuffin that pushes the party forward into the actual plot. Sometimes that is, this NPC is being chased by the villain and the party needs to protect them. Sometimes it's this NPC is a member of the local law enforcement and is now conscripting the party into helping with the latest evil. And sometimes it's this NPC just sold you a treasure map and then they disappear. Most of the time you need a person for the party to bounce off of, so that way the plot can happen. It's a very rare occasion where you start session one and the party is already like, we know what we're doing, we know our motivation, and now we're setting off in this direction. You can build a campaign to start that way, of course, but I find it a lot easier and a lot more effective in bringing the players into the narrative to have a character that they directly interact with who's like, okay, I would like you guys to do this because reasons.
Yeah, I mean, like in Star Wars, Luke was interested in joining the Flight Academy and leaving the planet, but he didn't do so until the quest-giving NPC of R2-D2 was like, here is a message from the princess. You know, it's definitely, I think, kind of a genre element in fantasy and sci-fi that the adventurers kind of need generally somebody to kick off a quest, to give them a quest to start with. Unless, like you said, you have a party that is starting off with a very strong goal and motivation. You know, like maybe we've dropped in and this is a party that has already been together for a little while and they have already, you know, but then the implication, of course, is that there's NPCs in their backstory who've sort of given them some information or motivation, etc. And we'll meet more as we go.
So you have your quest giver NPCs who are important to the plot. Like that's their entire role is to be important to the plot. And then on the flip side, you have your background NPCs. You have your extras, your shopkeeps, your other villagers, the people who are there in the background whose purpose is just to fill out the world and also give environmental details to the world itself. Like if your group walks into a city, there will be a difference in tone between whether everyone around them is well dressed and like walking to their well-paying jobs versus whether they're in dirty clothes covered in mud and like hauling heavy weights while someone else is like whipping their backs. None of these characters even need to have names, but they're important because they flesh out the world that the players are in. Side note, you do have to be careful because then sometimes one of the party members might see one of those poor peasants lifting a heavy weight and being whipped. And then they're like, oh, I'm going to save this person and they're going to be my best friend. And then then you have to roll out the random name generator tables and actually make this person a person.
Yeah, players love... we think that every detail is important and a plot hook.
And then somewhere in the middle between these like plot important NPCs and the background NPCs are what I consider faction NPCs. If you have like a major faction in your world or in your plot, the main way that your party is going to interact with them is through the people that they meet who are a part of that faction, and by extension, a representation of that faction. So, like, if you have a faction that's like, I don't know, like a militarized group, for example, whether they meet a private or they meet a general or another high-ranking official in that military, both of those characters are going to be representative of that faction as a whole. They can have their own opinions on that faction, but at the end of the day, because they are the main fulcrum that the party interacts with that faction, they are going to be... I keep saying this, they are going to be the most representative of that faction. And so you have to be careful when crafting these NPCs on how much you are communicating as this is uniquely that person versus how much you are communicating this is who they are because of the faction that they're with.
Yeah, that's an interesting little device you could use against the party, kind of, is if their introduction to a particular faction is solely through that NPC, really, and that colors how they view that faction, you could use that against them potentially of, oh, I really like this NPC, they seem super cool. What do you mean this faction is evil? I thought this faction was okay because I liked the NPC. Or vice versa. If you kind of want to set the players, for dramatic purposes or whatever, set the players kind of against a faction, if you have them represented initially by an NPC that is mean to the party, is kind of uncooperative or brusque with them, and the party's like, I don't like this NPC, I don't like this faction, and then you can kind of pull a twist on them later if they meet like a different NPC or uncover some sort of clue and realize, oh, there's layers, there's more going on here. You know, a lot of what we just keep coming down to is that you can have a lot of fun with complexity.
Oh yeah.
And with layers and with playing with expectations in this game. This game being whatever TTRPG TARP you want to play with.
Exactly. And these faction NPCs are also a great way to introduce these factions. One of my favorite RPGs isn't even a TTRPG or a TARP, as Kayla puts it, but is a video game RPG, Fallout New Vegas. And the way that they introduced two of the main factions, the old world styled government, New California Republic, versus the fascist Roman Empire imposters Caesar's Legion, is that like the first NCR guy you meet is a soldier who's like, hey, we'd like to help you out, but we're currently stretched thin and don't have a whole lot of resources. And then the first Caesar's Legion NPC you meet is like, I just crucified a bunch of these people in the name of our Lord Caesar because they were all degenerates, and you should tell the land that we're here. We're going to be spreading threats and violence until we conquer this whole land. And it's like, all right, I immediately have an idea of what these factions are. just through these two separate people.
So, and then, of course, the other thing with faction NPCs is they could or could not be previously connected with your players. So, if you are going into character creation and stuff, if you are saying, hey, we're starting in Seatown, I don't know. We're starting in Seatown, and my character is just going to be from Seatown, you know, I would know some of the NPCs, right? Like, can you just give me a quick bullet point list of some of the NPCs I might be familiar with? And that's kind of one way to sort of direct the party, is if there's a character that can be familiar with these NPCs, and you can sort of slide that to them ahead of time. Or when it comes up, you know, you could be like, hey, you would know, by the way, you would know this NPC. You've done dealings before. And then the player can be like, oh, okay. And that changes how the party might interact with the player or with the NPC, whether they've had previously established good relations or negative relations before the game ever started.
And then you have your NPCs that function mostly as obstacles. And, you know, these are the mooks that you fight, especially like, you know, the goblins that you fight in Dungeons and Dragons. But these are also the bouncer at the entrance to the bar, the palace guard that keeps you from the noble district, the merchant.
The mayor that's upset that you keep setting fire to different buildings.
Yeah, who is this mayor to keep us from our wanton arson?
Yeah, what's his problem? We're just having fun.
But if you need like an obstacle for the players to overcome in order to get an item or get into a certain area, having an NPC there to be like, you can't come in, and then representing a force that they have to go around, that's just a basic gameplay tenet right there. But it also creates a situation that your players have to figure out. Going back to, all right, there's a bouncer at the entrance to the bar. This is an NPC that has been placed there specifically to make it not easy to get into this bar. So it's, all right, are you going to try to convince the bouncer that you're supposed to be there? Are you going to try to bribe the bouncer? Are you going to try to beat up the bouncer? Or are you going to try to look for another solution and find like a back door or a way through the roof? But just by placing a person there, you suddenly create a situation and a problem that your characters need to solve.
Yeah, it's when you're coming up with puzzles and combats and things like that, an NPC that is just not like that just does not automatically allow the party someplace is a wonderful little piece of enrichment. Granted, they can be, depending on, you know, if you've got disguise self and a really high charisma score, it can be a lot easier to get past this person. But again, if you have the whole party with you, you know, that could be something where, yeah, I've rolled a really great deception check, but maybe the group deception check isn't so good. You know, so just as a little tip to other GMs that are like, I don't know, my warlock with Mask of Many Faces and super high charisma score keeps getting past all of these NPCs that I put as an obstacle because they just lie to the NPCs. You can create NPCs that maybe can see through illusions, or you can, maybe there's like multiple NPCs, or you could do group deception checks, etc. Like there's kind of ways to complicate that a little bit if the players are sort of getting around this a little too easily, maybe, or it's no longer a challenge for them.
And one other type of NPC that I haven't actually thought about until later in my like GMing career is wildlife. Because the animals that are in your world, just like the background NPCs that I talked about earlier, are a way to like reinforce the world building. You know, you can be in the wilds and then suddenly there's a bunch of like deer, or you can be in a post-apocalyptic world and suddenly there's a two-headed sheep, or you can be in like a steampunk city and the streets are filled with rats. And all of these different animals that you place within your world are another way to show another detail of that world. And I didn't really take wildlife as such a important way to flesh out a world until I played the video game Elden Ring.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, for those who have not played the FromSoft games, they became famous for Demon Souls and Dark Souls, and those are very like dark fantasy, like dead worlds. And any wildlife you encounter is either diseased, incredibly aggressive, or both. Like if you encounter a dog or a crab or a bird in Dark Souls, it is going to immediately try to kill you. But the thing that made me feel like Elden Ring was such a different world and a much more alive world was the addition of ambient wildlife. Like you walk around Elden Ring and there's just sheep and birds and turtles. And yes, there are birds that try to kill you in that game, but there are also birds that just hang out on perches and then fly away when you get close. And it's literally just the addition of that detail of wildlife made the world feel so much different than the more dead worlds of Dark Souls and Demon Souls and all that. It was fascinating for me when I noticed that.
And, that's an interesting point, because that makes me think, you talk about how not every bird is trying to kill you anymore. If you have players that poke at, I said earlier, players, we think that any detail is important and something that we need to go after. If you're kind of having that issue where you're just trying to build ambiance and your players think it's important and they keep going after it, layer it on, add more. And then they'll poke at it and you'll be like, yeah, it's just a bird. And they're like, oh, okay. And that'll sort of train the party into accepting, oh, this is ambiance. Not everything is something we need to poke at, and that'll save you from having to come up with things on the fly because the party is poking at things that they weren't supposed to poke at. And then you'll be able to kind of more easily emphasize what clue paths there might actually be. Because if you start out and you're only narrating or pointing out things that are important, the party is going to think that anything you mention is going to be important. And then that could be an issue for you later if you're trying to add in just ambiance and set the scene. And you say like, oh yeah, there's like 5 NPCs in this tavern. It's like the party's interrogating every single NPC in the tavern because they think they're all quest givings, because in session 1 there was only 1 or 2 NPCs in the tavern and both of them were quest giving NPCs. Layer in kind of that ambiance and setting like from the very beginning. And I think that'll help you and the players sort of get a communication rhythm going on what is ambiance and immersion that makes them feel more invested in the world, and then what are the select A to talk to this NPC and get a quest, Yeah. Or this detail is important. If you're light on details in the beginning and the only details you mention are plot relevant ones, you will accidentally train your players to think that any detail is really important. And I guess, Kevin, you could kind of talk about that a little bit more too, and we could discuss this maybe more in a later episode, of how you narrate stuff, your tone and intonations, giving those clues between what is ambiance and what is maybe hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Go look at that.
Yeah, that is always a line that I try to tread, because if you only give detail to the stuff that's important, then you're training your players to focus on the things that you describe. And, that comes down to the game teaches you how to play the game. And that's true for any game, by the way, whether it's a tabletop RPG or a video game or watching a TV show. It's the media itself teaches you how to consume it. So I always try to spread out details. And if I say like, hey, there's a bunch of people in the bar, like I'll usually give each of them like a little like appearance. But I'm also fully aware that if I like spend more than 5 seconds on a single NPC, the party is innately going to be like, okay, this person is important in some way.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the thing to always think about with NPCs. Like with all these roles, the quest givers, the background, the wildlife, the obstacles, the faction NPCs, they are either telling you something about the world, they are creating a situation for your players to work around, or they're doing both. And if they're not doing either of those things, then what is the NPC doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's the same thing when you're like writing a script. It's like when, you're looking over the characters in your movie or TV show and you're thinking, does this character need to be here, or do these 2 or 3 characters, can they just be one character and accomplish the same role?
Yes, perhaps what you should do when you're thinking about your NPCs is think like a line producer looking at a script and saying, this is a lot of people I need to pay. How can I make this more cost effective? Are there characters that can be consolidated? These characters are serving the same purpose, but there's 2 of them. Just combine them. And instead of paying 2 people $50, we'll pay one person $75 for this larger role. And I think that is good advice for NPCs. If you can reuse NPCs, then do so. And that'll help the party build a better relationship with that NPC over time, I think. So, if you're able to have a traveling, recurring NPC that kind of keeps popping up where the party needs them to be for whatever reason. I think that's a lot of fun, and it'll make them more. That'll make them memorable instead of having just a bunch of NPCs, you know, Bob and Sam and Jack and Jill and whatever that give out different quests in different towns. If you have, you know, Mark and Sarah, I keep using just the most generic
listen,
modern
keep going.
American names.
I have definitely used these names before in NPCs I had to create off the back
and
of my head.
And this is no shade to your names. No shade to your names. But if you just have like Mark and Sarah that are kind of traveling around and sort of keep running into the party wherever they go, the characters will be able to develop a relationship with Mark and Sarah. Whereas if you just keep giving them new NPCs all of the time, either the party is not going to be as invested in the world because they're not going to get attached to these characters because they know these characters aren't going to stick around, or they will pick one, and guess what? That one gets to stick around now because we want to be invested in the world. We want to care about it. So giving the party a couple of NPCs that they can care about if they so choose, if that's their style, really. Because, I mean, like you mentioned, some parties treat NPCs as hirelings and plot devices, and they're not interested in building a relationship with them. And that's totally fine, you know, because it probably helps the DM have a little bit less homework, and you have the other players at the table that you can interact with and have these dynamics with. But some groups are going to want an NPC here or there to care about. And I think personally, for myself, I do enjoy having a couple of NPCs because it does kind of give the character a little bit more motivation, some higher stakes, because, you know, I care about my fellow party members, the other PCs, but I also know how capable these other PCs are. And the NPCs are maybe a little squishier, a little bit less capable. And I've gotten attached to them, so now I'm making choices. And that's the thing about our party is we make choices to save our NPCs at cost to the party and to the PCs because we find it to be interesting dramatically, I think. Whereas if, you know, maybe that's not your party style. Maybe you're like, I'm not going to waste resources on an NPC. They're not as real as a PC. And I mean, that would be an fascinating case study to pull a whole bunch of parties and their relationships with PCs. And then also just like, I don't know if it necessarily has something to do with like general empathy levels. I don't know if that's really like fully it, but maybe it's kind of the difference between approaching the tabletop role-playing game similar to how one approaches like a video game versus people that approach it a little bit more like narratively, like a TV show or something like that, where it's like you kind of get invested in these characters. I don't know. It would be, I think it's it's pretty variable. And I'm not saying like if you don't care about the NPCs, then you lack empathy. Like that's ridiculous. But I do kind of wonder if people who maybe have a more background in video games, if they're less likely to attach to NPCs versus people who have a background more in watching TV shows or books or whatever, and they attach to the side characters more.
Well, I think that's one of the biggest parts of the fun with tabletop RPGs is you have these characters who can interact directly with you. Like you play a video game, at the end of the day, the NPC will only say what it is programmed to say from like a list of responses that you can both give it and it will give back to you. But at the table, you know, excluding solo RPGs here where like the NPCs are under pre-programmed, but it's like within like the written bounds of the solo RPG itself. But in like a group tabletop RPG, the NPC is another player at the table, a GM who can talk with you and interact with you in real time while your character is talking with them. In that way, the NPC is a real person because there's a real person playing it.
Yeah.
You also talk about like NPCs who become close to the party, and that's kind of like the final NPC role I want to get into, and we mentioned it at the beginning of this episode, but the DMPC. And this is a role that I have had NPCs kind of fall backward into. The greater understanding of a DMPC is a character that the DM creates because he too wants to be a PC in the world that he's running. And then the GM may use the same character creation rules, maybe they don't. But there's this negative opinion of them because it turns into the GM putting the spotlight on their DM PC, and then suddenly all the players at the table are watching the DM play with themselves. It's, oh, hey, my really cool character is now going to fight this monster, and I'm going to roll dice for both of them. And then the rest of the players at the table are like, what are we doing?
Yeah, you're just watching one person play.
Exactly. But the way I'll use DM PCs is that it's usually a prominent NPC that the characters cling on to the point where they are a member of the party. And, even more than like a hireling or just like an assistant NPC that's there to like carry stuff or be a squire or whatever, but like an NPC who feels like an additional character of the party and like has their own character arc, and a lot of times will follow the party from like beginning to end. Now, playing those characters, I specifically try to keep them from the spotlight as much as possible. Like, decisions should be made by the rest of the players at the table, but I will use that DM PC to put in little bits of information while decisions are being made. So, it's like, oh, where should we go to next? We could go here, we could go here. I'll have the DM PC be like, well, if you remember, over here is this thing that we might want. But over here is this thing we might want to avoid. But we could potentially get this other thing that we might want. And so I'm not making a decision as these characters, but I am using them once again for the utility of dropping information that the characters maybe do not know, or maybe they forgot, while also still playing them as the characters themselves, because they're not going to say anything that their character concept wouldn't say.
Yeah, it's really interesting to kind of see the evolution of the party NPCs and the ones that have kind of become DM PCs through our last few campaigns, because the first one we started with, Out of the Abyss, starts with a jailbreak, and there are other people in the jail that are not the PCs, and it is really just a matter of rolling the dice and the decisions that the PCs make with regard to how many of these NPCs make it out of the jailbreak, and then what happens to those NPCs after the jailbreak. And we managed to get a lot of them out. I think only one died. We got every NPC out minus one, and then we kept them because we got emotionally attached. But they were all very NPCs. I think there was only one that ended up really becoming a stronger proto-DM PC, and that was one that a character started like a romantic relationship with. Mm-hmm. So then that became a convenient plot device to, for lack of a better term, manipulate the player characters. And when I talk about the DM manipulating the player characters, I talk about it, I mean it in this similar way to how a director might manipulate actors, or a writer might manipulate the characters on the page. Of like, the world, you make choices that drive the plot forward as characters, but the world does interact with you. And NPCs can interact with the PCs and affect the choices that they make. So when I say Kevin manipulating us, I don't mean it in a Kevin is forcing us to make different decisions, just in a Kevin is reacting to the choices that we are making, and then doing or saying things or whatever that are putting us in corners, so to speak, in the sense of like, our character now needs to make like choice A or choice B, like, because that's what happens in video games and TV shows and movies, is that characters kind of end up in corners, and then it's like, oh, what are they going to do now? Mm-hmm. And they have forks in the road. So when I say Kevin manipulates us, I mean that he gets us into a fork in the road, and then we have to make a plot changing decision that's going to have ramifications. The PCs now in Curse of Strahd, there's like, it's funny because I think there's kind of two layers, and it's sort of the two DM PCs and then two of the other NPCs. And my character very much does not care as much about the other two NPCs that are attached. They are retainers of another PC. So, that PC who's like, these are my servants and retainers who have come into this situation with us, I'm very attached to them. The rest of the party's like, less so. But we are definitely, we treat it's like kind of a, for lack of a better term, a little bit of a caste system with the NPCs attached to the party on the ones who we treat more like real PCs versus NPCs.
And that comes back to, as a GM, you need to be prepared for the players to have different reactions to your NPCs than you might expect. And sometimes different reactions per PC. One PC might, love this one companion, and this other PC might hate their guts. And you just kind of have to play that NPC while navigating that space. And going back to talking about the NPCs, during this conversation, I think it would be better to change the name of that to companion, because that's really what they are.
Yes.
Functioning a lot like companions in, video game RPGs, like Fallout and Elder Scrolls and all that. A character who is important enough to have a name, to accompany you, to fill out details of world building, to aid you in battle, but who ultimately does not decide where you go next or what major decisions you make. They can give opinions, but at the end of the day, their utility in the world is to be an NPC by your side who has some importance, who the characters can interact with, but ultimately does not take the spotlight and point it.
Yeah, I think an interesting sort of example when looking at video games, because I've played a fairly limited number of video games. I enjoy them. I get motion sick, and that can be a bit of an obstacle. But as an example, Ellie in the first Last of Us game, Ellie's an NPC. Ellie's a companion. There is a portion of the game, a very small portion of the game, where you do play as Ellie, and it switches up on you. But for the vast majority of the game, she is simply an NPC, but she has a very full personality, and she is driving the decisions that Joel, the PC, is making. Yeah, that companion, that DMPC, would be like Ellie versus any of the other characters that only pop up for a scene or two here and there.
That's interesting to think about, actually. Ellie as a companion NPC in Last of Us. Because video games do have a tradition of having companion NPCs who, some of whom are not as well regarded. I'm thinking about Ashlee in the original Resident Evil 4, where her whole purpose was not only being the plot device, but also being kidnapped all the time. So she was more of a contrivance than an actual assistance, versus, Ellie in Last of Us, who is actively helping you in your quest.
Yeah.
Who is by your side, in the dirt with you, fighting back to back. And it's, with these companion NPCs, the big thing is that because they have a larger role in the narrative, they can inspire larger emotions from their interactions.
Yeah, I mean, Ellie is a child, and thus she needs to be protected, and her assistance is somewhat limited. But as the game goes on, her and Joel get better at working together, and Ellie's strengths come out, and Ellie is able to help Joel. And that's sort of what, if you're going to have a DMPC or a companion, that's kind of the idea that you're thinking of. This is not a character that's as strong as the PCs, but it is a character that can be an asset to the PCs. And it's something that gives the PCs stakes if they get emotionally invested in them, of putting them in danger. That's a way to sort of, if you want your PCs to go fight this faction, maybe they kidnap that companion. So it's just if you're thinking about these NPCs, you can look towards video games for an idea of maybe how to construct that NPC or how to proceed as the party becomes more attached to them. And yeah, if you have an NPC that's just there to get kidnapped constantly or be a liability or be in danger, that's something to keep keep that in mind. If your party is bringing along NPCs, what is a way to feasibly sort of set the NPCs aside to be safe in combat? And coming up with a way to do that so the players can have their little friends that come with them, but they don't have to necessarily worry about carrying them into combat where they would get immediately one-shotted by a villain. And whether that's some sort of wagon that has a ward on it that works for 8 hours and they can all go sit in the wagon. And, maybe it's a small wagon, so that's why the whole party can't just constantly hide in it, but it can fit a couple of the NPCs that we've taken along, and they could go sit in there and be protected from the forces of evil or something while you go into the dungeon. I don't know. You can use NPCs against your players in fun ways.
Mm-hmm.
Try not to use it against them in ways that they don't love. And that's just something that you're gonna figure out as a party. But yeah, giving plot armor to some NPCs could just be useful.
And these are all things to think about when you have time to like write down these NPCs and figure out their place in the world and how they're going to move the adventure along if the party interacts with them. But as every GM knows, sometimes you just need to create an NPC off the top of your head. So here's a quick tip for you. If you ever need to create an NPC just on the fly, you just need to fill out 4 things: name, appearance, voice, purpose. The name, that there's a ton of random name generators online, lists of names. A lot of RPGs now come published with like tables of names, especially if it's like a fantasy world building. It's like, here's what the names sound like from this region kind of thing. But literally you can Google like blank name generator and you can come up with one off the top of your head. So, you know, it's like, oh, the party goes into this blacksmith. The blacksmith is named Smokey Joe. All right, next. Their appearance. You just need one thing for the appearance. You can do 2 or 3, or you can describe their appearance in full. But as we said earlier, be mindful that the more you describe someone's appearance, the more the party is going to think that they are important. So usually I will just go with like one appearance detail. So it's like you walk in and Smokey Joe has a beard. Boom. Or Smokey Joe is bald and has an eye patch. And it's like, oh, okay, that's a memorable detail. He's the eye patch guy. But if it's like you walk in and you see a portly man who's balding along the side, a lazy eye with a scar over it, a thick beard that's covered with ash, and 2 peg legs that he's walking around, and you hear the wood tapping onto the wood of the floor itself. Like, I spent a lot of time just describing that guy there, so it's like, oh, we need to pay attention to Smoking Joe.
Yeah, that's an important guy. I've written down all of these details.
Yeah.
With exclamation points. I have to remember this NPC. This is an important NPC.
But, you know, thinking back to name, appearance, voice, purpose, the purpose for Smokey Joe might just be like, oh, he's just the blacksmith. He is just there to do the transaction of them buying armor. But because I spent all that time in their appearance, suddenly the players are like, oh, we got to spend more time with Smokey Joe here because he's probably going to unlock a side quest or something like that. And then I'm having a conversation that I don't want to have because I want these guys to move away from Smokey Joe.
Yeah.
Final thing is the voice, because I skipped over voice and went straight to purpose. But yeah, the voice. I'll say this. I know that some GMs don't like doing voices. They don't think they're good at doing a bunch of different voices. They think it's too silly. I understand. I don't agree with you, but I understand. My advice is if you're a GM, and especially you're having fun with your friends, lean into the voices. Just little quirks within how you talk can go miles to, you know, describing the character and giving them details. And here's the deal. I only have so many voices. I am not a professional voice actor. And if I play with groups long enough, eventually they start pointing out like, oh, hey, that's Otis's voice. And I'm like, okay, forget that one. He was 2 campaigns ago.
Well, and then also, like, it just as a larger point to everybody, even professional voice actors don't necessarily have 50 different accents and voices in their stable. Even like some professional voice actors, they basically have 2 voices, you know, that maybe like their regular voice and then kind of like a second, maybe like their old man voice or their kid voice or whatever. There are professional voice actors who don't throw their voice around as much as others. So just as a note for your own, I guess, confidence heading into this, if you don't come from a background where you are familiar with acting in any way, shape, or form, you can act with the voice that you have.
Yeah.
And also with accents, this is a made-up world, so like a Scottish accent doesn't exist. So if your best approximation of a Scottish accent, that'll do. That'll do. It doesn't have to be spot on.
And when thinking of the voice itself can dramatically change the tone of the interaction, even if you're saying the same thing. Like you walk into Smokey Joe, the blacksmith who has a beard shop, there's a difference between, you know, me going, hello, how can I help you? Versus, hello, how can I help you? Versus, hello, how can I help you?
Yeah, these are all 3 different characters that we are interacting with.
Same sentence.
You've mostly changed intonation, really. You know, you did like kind of a normal one, a slightly deeper one, and then like a semi like flirtatious one.
Yeah.
And that was, that was three very different characters with very minimal changes to your own voice. I think kind of one of the things, just going off of this for a little bit, I think part of the reason that some people might have difficulty with it is you're kind of afraid of like doing it wrong or like being embarrassing or whatever. I feel that myself all of the time with doing characters, or when I do GM and I have to think like I want to do slightly different voices, if only to help the players distinguish different NPCs from each other, especially if there's kind of like two NPCs in this scene. I don't want both of them to have the same voice because I want to make it clear like who's talking when. There's something about it that if you're not an actor or you don't have any background in acting and you're newer to it, or even if you're not newer to it, there is something that's like, oh, I kind of gotta, like a little bit of a hurdle sort of shame and embarrassment that you gotta get out of, and you kind of just need to plow through on it, I think.
Yeah. If you get anything from this episode of our podcast, it's go wild with it. Whatever NPC you create, like, you are also a player at the table, so have fun with them. And if you don't want to do voices, you don't have to do voices. I prefer having a bunch of different voices because I think that helps differentiate all these different NPCs and like set different tones. But, at the end of the day, I'm not going to hold a gun to your head and say, do the voice, do the funny voice, DM man.
Yeah, I mean, if it helps you to just kind of pitch your voice a little bit between NPCs and just like, oh yeah, this NPC has a little bit of a higher pitched voice versus this NPC is a little deeper in their register. I think that can be an easier approach for people.
Yeah.
Versus trying to really throw their voice or do different accents. I think accents is kind of what people sort of think of first when they think about voices. They think accents. And it's like, no, you can kind of just do it based off of speaking at a slightly higher or lower register than you normally would, maybe. And then vocabulary can be helpful with your NPCs. Maybe some of your NPCs are more articulate and have a higher vocabulary than others. And some of the NPCs are, they speak more plainly or more straightforward. That's another example of ways to differentiate them is off of word choice. That's a big thing when you're writing characters in like novels and movies is their word choice. Because actors, of course, will come in with their own voice, but you still have to give them the words, and their vocabulary and the way that they speak is how you differentiate them. So you could just think about like, yeah, this NPC uses a bunch of slang versus this NPC speaks in very short sentences, and that'll help you build out these NPCs and differentiate them without having to do all sorts of different wild accents for each of them.
At the end of the day, in order to make an NPC memorable, you really just need one or two details. And like, also keep in mind name, appearance, voice, and purpose. But in appearance and voice, like, I appreciate it when professionally written like RPG products, like they will introduce an NPC as this person, Thelma, and then in parentheses, like Snaggletooth loves to pickpocket. It's like, I already know who this character is now, just from like 5 words.
Interesting. That is, what do you think? Sorry, this is just a question that I've had multiple times. So do you, like, when you're looking at official modules, you've mentioned those little details are helpful to you. When it's like a bigger NPC that might play a larger role in the story and become something of a DMPC, is it more frustrating if there's a lot of detail? Like, do you want them to have a lot of detail in the module about that NPC, or do you prefer it to be a little bit more open, like bare bones, so that you can kind of add stuff at will? Like, what is...
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because in my experience, like, I say that I like it when an NPC description is like their name and then in parentheses like 1 or 2 descriptors, because that's pretty much all you need. And my experience is that a lot of NPCs in official products, and this, multiple games, this is not just Dungeons and Dragons, but I will say that Dungeons and Dragons is kind of a big culprit of this, is that they don't give even that level of description to NPCs. Like, a lot of times they'll just say like, oh, this guard named Mac. And I'm like, okay, can you give me anything else? Because I'm going to have to play this character, and now I'm going to have to make up a bunch of stuff for them. And like I said, the bar is literally just giving that level of description. If an NPC has a paragraph written about them, in my experience, they're like an incredibly plot relevant NPC. But for the most part, like, you know, NPCs will just have like a sentence or two talking about like their background, maybe. I have rarely encountered a situation where an NPC was given a level of detail in an official RPG product, and I still felt like I needed to take them out. Because a lot of times the NPCs I'll take out are the ones that just feel like they're filling up space. And I go back to, does this NPC give something important about the world or give something important about the plot? And if they don't answer either one of those questions, why are they there? And a lot of times when I combine NPCs, it's because these NPCs work better as one person doing either the world building detail or giving the plot relevant information, rather than like, oh, this NPC comes in and accomplishes this, but then they disappear. And then another NPC comes in and accomplishes the same thing, and then they disappear. And then another NPC comes in and they accomplish the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, why isn't this just one person?
Yeah, and we talked about that a little bit in the beginning of like having a couple of NPCs that keep popping up regularly. If they're not traveling with the party, the party will revisit them frequently, either by going back to their like shop if they're a shopkeeper, or the NPC is a world traveler and just happens to be in similar locations as the PCs because the PCs keep going to places that are like tourist traps or something like that.
And we also talk about this a little bit in our bonus episode where we go over Curse of Strahd and kind of talk about not only analyzing the book itself, but also like analyzing the different decisions I've made and the multiple times I've run that module of like tweaking it to the party or like tweaking certain things from like the raw module itself. Which, audience, by the way, if you want to hear Kayla and I talk about Curse of Strahd in depth, you can go to our Ko-fi page and pledge to gain access to our bonus episodes. That will be one of the bonus episodes that we'll have available for you to view as long as you support us.
Yeah, because that's one of the big things that we're going to get into in Curse of Strahd is me figuring out how much of some of these important characters are Kevin improving and how much is like in the actual stated module, because there are some fascinating characters in Curse of Strahd and some very beloved and beloathed characters in Curse of Strahd. So it is, I want to know. And it's interesting too to get into the community a little bit and see sort of how other players regard these characters versus our own party and stuff. So that's part of why I'm like, oh, Kevin, tell me, give me the dirt on who was this canon, or did you change this? Is this unique to our storyline? What did you add, etc.? Because I do always find it to be so interesting when we get to the end of a module, or as we go through a module and Kevin says, oh yes, I added that, or no, that was in the book. And we're like, what? I thought you added that because it seemed so, customized to our party, or like, wait, what do you mean you added that? That wasn't in the module? Like, holy shit, So yeah, we'll have an entire episode about that where we talk about arguably the most popular 5e module thus far. Everybody's favorite bad boy, Strahd.
Yes, but the only way to hear us talk about that will be to go to our Ko-fi page and pledge to listen to our bonus episodes.
Link in the bio.
Kayla, it does mean a lot to me that there are NPCs that I've played that you hold near and dear to your heart.
Oh, yeah.
Truly, it does warm my heart. But audience, we want to hear about some of the most memorable NPCs you've encountered. And if there's any tips to crafting NPCs that we may have missed in this episode, be sure to share your wisdom in the comments of this episode. Mm-hmm. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah.
Now, if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, leave a comment, and share it with a friend. Once again, the most effective form of advertising is word of mouth. Follow us on social media. We got the links in the show notes. We also have a Ko-fi, which we mentioned earlier. You can support us there and get access to cool bonus content like extra episodes and access to our private Discord where you can talk to other nerds who love talking about nerdy stuff. Be sure to check it out. Writing for Roleplay is a production of Digital Kaiju Studios. It is hosted and produced by Kevin Carpenter and Kayla Knutson. It is edited mostly by Kevin because Kayla volunteered to do other stuff.
My machinations are secret and many.
We post a new episode every Tuesday, so until then, see you next week.